Partei gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Es ist unser Wunsch und Wille, dass dieser Staat und dieses Reich bestehen sollen in den kommenden Jahrtausenden. Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört. Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung! Es lebe Deutschland!
Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
Amongst the books that the Nazis burned in 1933 were the works of Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish 19th century poet who wrote, "When you hear a crashing such as never before has been heard in the world's history, then you know that the German thunderbolt has fallen at last. At that uproar the eagles of the air will drop dead, and lions in the remotest deserts of Africa will hide in their royal dens. A play will be performed in Germany which will make the French Revolution look like an innocent idyll." The first concentration camps were erected in spring 1933. With 5 million unemployed, Hitler knew that he had to contain the growing depth of restlessness. He began a program of public works, tirelessly touring the country, laying foundation stones and engendering enthusiasm for himself and his policies with every mile of autobahn that was built. Life in Germany was improving, and Hitler was the man responsible. Yet he was not clear of his problems. The army and the SA under Röhm were competing for power for their own organizations. Röhm wanted to see himself as head of a single German defense force and disband the official German armed forces, the Reichswehr. He wanted the Nazis to seize power by force, whereas Hitler was determined to erode democracy from inside its defenses. Hitler found himself standing against the SA, whose tendency for street violence aggravated him. The situation worsened as Röhm's belligerence grew. In this film, Hitler has arrived at an SA meeting flanked by his personal guards, the SS. It was a show of power that Röhm would have done well to take heed of. Yet the speech is heavy with praise for the SA members. Hitler needed them to remain on his side. Not so the SA leadership. For them, the end was in sight. By the end of June 1934, Röhm had overplayed his hand. He wanted to be Minister of Defense, and demanded that the Reichswehr and its professional officers, that he saw as lacking in revolutionary spirit, be assimilated into the SA, which now contained almost 3 million members. Hitler feared a coup attempt from his old street-fighting comrade. When Röhm presented the Minister for Defense, Werner von Blomberg, with a memorandum demanding the SA become the nation's armed force, Hindenburg threatened to impose martial law if Hitler did not act. Hitler was only too pleased to act. From the 30th of June until July the 2nd, Hitler sent out his SS and Gestapo on assassination missions, and Röhm and many of his SA comrades were summarily executed. Hitler didn't stop there. Von Papen was arrested. Schleicher and even leaders of other conservative parties were executed, as were many who had voiced opposition to the Nazis. Gustav Kahr, who had opposed Hitler's 1923 putsch attempt, paid now for that decision with his life as the SS hacked him to death. This was the night of the long knives. It enhanced the Gestapo's reputation for terror and left no one in any doubt that the same fate awaited anyone who dared to cross the Nazi leader. Gregor Strasser, one-time Nazi member, was put under arrest by Hitler, who personally gave the order for his murder. Strasser was assassinated by the Gestapo in his cell. Shortly before his death, he had written to a friend, "Whatever happens, mark what I say. From now on, Germany is in the hands of an Austrian who is a congenital liar, a former officer who is a pervert, and a clubfoot. And I tell you the last is the worst of them all. This is Satan in human form." The SS unit, known as Totenkopf, became an independent organization. The now powerless SA gave Hitler a pledge of allegiance. On July the 13th, 1934, Hitler justified the purge in a nationally broadcast speech to the Reichstag. "In this hour I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme judge of the German people. I gave the order to shoot the ringleaders in this treason, and I further gave the order to cauterize down to the raw flesh the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells in our domestic life. Let the nation know that its existence, which depends on its internal order and security, cannot be threatened with impunity by anyone. And let it be known for all time to come that if anyone raises his hand to strike the state, then certain death is his lot." Dollfuss, the Austrian dictator, felt the brutal truth of these words when on July the 25th he was assassinated by 8 Austrian Nazis during a coup attempt. Dollfuss had banned the Austrian Nazi Party and formed an alliance with Mussolini against Germany, thus making an enemy of Hitler. When Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934, Hitler knew that his hour had come. Goebbels had arranged the funeral ceremony and cleverly wove the traditions of an imperial past, represented by Hindenburg and the attendant Prussian landed nobility, the Reichswehr and the Nazi SA. Hitler bowed before Hindenburg, as cynical and politically duplicitous as ever. No one stood between him and absolute power. The office of president, Hitler declared, would be merged with his own, and he became Führer and Reichskanzler. Hitler was now a dictator to whom the army, on the orders of Defense Minister von Blomberg, had to swear their oath of allegiance.
Bei Gott, diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler, dem Oberbefehlshaber der Wehrmacht,
The 5th of September 1934. Hitler attended a rally in Nuremberg, flying in to his cheering supporters under the watchful eye of the cameras of Leni Riefenstahl. Goebbels had found one of the most willing foot soldiers for his propaganda war. Hitler was portrayed as godlike, the closest thing to a Roman emperor it was possible to be. For her efforts, Riefenstahl was rewarded with the German Film Prize Gold Medal in 1935. Adolf Hitler needed manual workers. But he needed to have all men trained in military-style formations. Anyone who refused to participate in Hitler's re-education programs could expect a visit by the SS. In 1934, Hitler had pronounced that the battle between German racial ideas and the Slav masses could no longer be avoided. This would lead to permanent mastery of the world. His aims were clear to anyone who wanted to listen. No one except the Nazis wanted to believe him.
Wir standen nicht im Schützengraben und nicht im Trommelfeuer der Granaten und sind trotzdem Soldaten.
It was the turn of the socialists to be rounded up. The repression continued with renewed vigor. New laws removed German citizenship from all those of Jewish origin. Marriage between non-Jews and Jews was prohibited. Jewish businesses were closed and looted, and Jews were banned from working in the civil service, the arts, or farming. In 1935, Hitler introduced conscription, in contravention of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Western powers did not oppose the move, believing that Germany had a right to maintain armed forces for its own defense. The 100,000 men allowed under the treaty grew to 500,000. But that was just the beginning. Hitler wanted the largest, most efficient armed force in the world for his expansion plans. But he built his army gradually, so that no one would feel they had a real reason to stop him until it was too late. The Saarland in southwest Germany, occupied by France and Britain after World War I, was restored to Germany after a plebiscite in March 1935. This was also the year that Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful and manipulative private secretary and fixer, bought some land around the Obersalzberg Mountains near Munich, which eventually became the Berghof, Hitler's country retreat. The next stage of Hitler's plan involved the military for the first time. German troops reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland on the 7th of March 1936, another breach of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler displayed the brinkmanship that was to take him to glory when, after German troops had crossed to the west of the Rhine, he was informed that French troops were on the border. He told his generals the German troops would stay unless the French made a move. They did not. These actions pleased many Germans, of course, and with stability restored and the endless trouble seemingly over, Hitler stood high in their estimation. He had reduced unemployment from 6 million to 1 million. Foreign capital was being invested in Germany, despite knowledge of what was happening beneath the propaganda lies. Hitler continued to show two faces. On the one hand, the leadership was keen to emphasize its caring side. The Labour Front organized affordable holidays and travel for workers, whilst behind the scenes, Hitler and his fellow Nazi leaders were preparing to use the people they purported to look after for their true role in Hitler's state, as warriors for his megalomania. As the majority of Germans enjoyed the quiet years until 1939, under Heinrich Himmler, the SS and Gestapo increased their stranglehold on the population. The SS grew into a gigantic organization, filled with those who were the ideological pinnacle of German Nazism, using violence and suppression to form the society Hitler wanted. Eventually, the rest of Europe would be subjected to the same terror. Young people were the lifeblood of the Thousand-Year Reich, and Hitler bound them into his ideology from an early age. Their enthusiasm for ideals was ruthlessly exploited. The Hitler Youth for Boys and the Association of German Girls was militarized and prepared the young for the task ahead, the push for Lebensraum. More babies were needed to fill the new Lebensraum, so family planning clinics were closed. In mass rallies with the youth of Germany, it was impressed upon them that their duty was the community, the common good. The individual existed only in its duty to serve that community. The young were his race of superior beings who would bring about his new world. A world that was rooted in the mythical past, symbolized by the blood banner, from which power was supposed to flow into all the other flags. The signs of this Hitler fantasy world were easily found. The dangerous manifestations of a man unable to deal with the natural world, and therefore determined to bend it to something he could understand and subdue. As unchallenged creator of this world, he could travel in style, giving his simple speeches, always fated, opinionated, his distorted fantasies presented with no limits set. Berlin held little of interest for him, and he was seldom there. He preferred the easy life of the travelling hero to the onerous duties of Chancellor. Hitler seemed to be everywhere, proclaiming his only mission in life was peace. The Olympic Games of 1936 were intended to prove the superiority of the new Nazi way. Although terror and rearmament were walking hand in hand, and the rest of the world believed this to be so, Germany was presented as a place of contentment, at ease with itself and its neighbours. Hitler's new life was the stuff of his dreams, forged in poverty in Vienna. Now he was able to indulge in the good things that money could provide. Architecture was one of his pleasures, and Albert Speer was one of many architects who would be presented with sketches of his ideas to rebuild German towns. Speer was responsible for the new chancellery. In the monumental style that Hitler favoured, it took a mere 9 months to build, yet not one single cabinet meeting ever took place in the new building. Speer, it has been said, was everything that Hitler wanted to be, and the Führer identified with his clever and sophisticated architect, never losing his regard for him. In July 1936, Hitler sent planes and troops to help Franco in the Spanish Civil War. This was to be the first test of the fighting ability of his men. By September, Hitler had given his permission to form the Germans into the Condor Legion. Against Göring's initial opposition, Hitler wanted the Luftwaffe to play their part in the war, and it was in Spain that the Bf 109 proved its worth in the hands of pilots such as Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland. Tanks were sent, as was the 88mm anti-aircraft gun that was used to devastating effect during World War II. Although there was international public condemnation following the bombing of Guernica on the 26th of April 1937, no one seemed to hear the alarm bells ringing or see the contradictions between Hitler's public expressions and the actions he took, and if they did hear, they turned away. Hitler's brinkmanship was bringing him ever further along the path to his ultimate goal. Hitler was pleased with the war in Spain, and had ordered 3 major military operations there by the time it finished in 1939. He was able to help Mussolini in Spain, and so ease Italy into a closer alliance with Nazi Germany, whilst keeping Britain and France in conflict with Italy. A victory for Franco would mean another fascist state on France's borders. With the help of Hitler and Mussolini, Franco won his dictatorship. The war also found Hitler in indirect confrontation with his future adversary Stalin, as the communist leader sent technical and military help to the Republicans. Britain and France imposed an arms embargo, and this seriously hampered the Republican struggle. It was Hitler's first real indication of the reluctance of the Western powers to get involved in armed conflict. In 1938, Hitler commissioned a new car for his master race. The result was the people's car, the Volkswagen. This was one of the last peaceful contributions to German history before Hitler began to finalize his plans for what the years of power had been leading towards: the acquisition of land in the east, and therefore, inevitably, war. By February he had abolished the Ministry of War and sacked 16 generals. From now on, he proclaimed, "I take personal command over the armed forces." Over 40 other generals resigned. Hitler had been brought up a Catholic, and although only nominally still a member when he died, he knew how to use Christianity to keep the churches and religious wing on his side. When addressing the Reichstag on March 23, 1933, he had said, "The national government regards the two Christian confessions, meaning Catholicism and Protestantism, as factors essential to the soul of the German people. We hold the spiritual forces of Christianity to be indispensable elements in the moral elevation of most of the German people."
Und hege felsenfest die Überzeugung, dass eben doch dann einmal die Stunde kommt, in der die Millionen, die uns heute verfluchen, hinter uns stehen und mit uns begrüßen werden dann das gemeinsam geschaffene, mühsam erkämpfte, bitter erworbene neue deutsche Reich der Größe und der Ehre und der Kraft und der Herrlichkeit und der Gerechtigkeit. Amen.
How long Hitler would have tolerated religion is unclear, but it is doubtful that it would have had any place in his new world filled with the men and women of the master race. Whilst in Vienna, he had come across the writing of former monk Lanz von Liebenfels, and his theories of the Aryan races as God-men, the development of blue-eyed blonde Aryans, the sterilization of what he termed lower races, and the incineration of the Jews. In Vienna, Hitler collected the works of Liebenfels, and the two men's views certainly corresponded greatly. But the connection embarrassed the Führer once he was in power, and he banned Liebenfels from publishing his writings. Once Hitler was dead, Liebenfels branded him as being from inferior racial stock. Hitler openly disparaged interest in the esoteric or ancient German god worship, stating, "It seems to me that nothing would be more foolish than to re-establish the worship of Wotan. Our old mythology ceased to be viable when Christianity implanted itself. Nothing dies unless it is moribund." Yet there were many ancient German symbols visible during the many parades that Hitler watched, and he was aware of the potent effect for propaganda of the symbolism associated with pagan gods and tales of heroism by powerful warriors. He wished to inspire in the modern Germans the same awe towards himself and the Nazi cause.
Sind vergänglich, aber Deutschland wird bestehen. Wir werden sterben, aber Deutschland muss leben, jetzt und immer.
Europe had chosen to ignore the warning Hitler had sent when the Luftwaffe took part in the 1936 Spanish Civil War. Yet in Mein Kampf he had written, "Man is a fighting animal. A nation, being a community of fighters, is a fighting unit. Any organism which ceases to fight is doomed to destruction." In 1938, another warning came. Austria was annexed without a shot being fired. The Austrians welcomed the move. The unification of the German people was one more step along the road to eradicating the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Although Britain, France and Italy raised their voices against the annexation, Hitler was allowed his triumphant entry into Austria following the invasion by the German army on the 12th of March. Hitler basked in the glory. Hitler had long sought closer ties with Mussolini's Italy, but the Italian leader had remained at arm's length, despite Hitler's initial admiration for the Italian fascist leader and his movement. They had met in Munich during the early years of Hitler's National Socialists. Among other things, Hitler had borrowed the fascist salute from his Italian neighbour. Mussolini had been right to suspect his larger neighbour in the north. Hitler was not looking for an equal partner. All he required was support against his enemies for as long as he needed it. However, at this meeting in 1937, the bond seemed as close as it was possible to be. The torchlight procession seemed an omen, and fire appeared increasingly to be the favoured element of the Nazis. Appropriately, the darkness was sought and approved by Hitler, who was himself wrapped up in the mysticism with himself as the representative of the god that was his benefactor, more and more content to allow himself to be worshipped. Hitler was now confident enough to demand more land. He wanted the Sudetenland, the border areas of Czechoslovakia inhabited mostly by Czech Germans. Konrad Heinlein, leader of the Sudeten German Party, went about making claims from the Czech government that, in his own words, could not be satisfied, and instigated 2 coup attempts before fleeing to Germany. In France and Britain there was great unease at the course Germany was embarked upon, and Winston Churchill, who wrote a book in 1938 entitled Why England Slept, was critical of the policy of appeasement that so many others supported. A week before Munich he warned, "The partition of Czechoslovakia under pressure from England and France amounts to the complete surrender of the Western democracies to the Nazi threat of force. Such a collapse will bring peace or security neither to England nor to France." Hitler's demands were to be negotiated at a conference in Munich attended by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier, Hitler and Mussolini. The Czech government was not invited. For Hitler this was not a conference but merely a confirmation of what he and Mussolini had already agreed upon. Hitler said bluntly that unless the Sudetenland, with its 80% German-speaking population, was incorporated into Germany, there would be war. Daladier knew already that Hitler was seeking domination in Europe, but he finally ceded to Chamberlain's desire for avoiding war. Chamberlain and Daladier now had nothing to do but sign the already prepared agreement. Hitler was playing the game on his terms and winning every move. Playing to the desire for peace in everyone but himself, he held the upper hand. Czechoslovakia had been sacrificed to Chamberlain's fears. 2 days after the signing of the Munich Agreement on the 30th of September 1938, and Chamberlain's welcome home with his imagined peace, German troops were in the Sudetenland. Hitler saw another piece of his jigsaw fall into place, and the War of Flowers, as this period came to be known, was about to come to a violent end. But for now he could claim that he had simply righted the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles, restoring German people to the fatherland. Many in Britain were in sympathy with that perception. He had no more territorial claims in Europe, he told the world, and the world was happy to believe him. Hitler represented more to the Germans than power. He became the object of sexual fantasy, an almost mystical being in whom his adoring people invested the mythical potency sown by his own imagination. He became the ideal, untouchable, incorruptible, invincible. By remaining a man apart, calm and rock-like amidst the vast crowds, admiration became adoration that was no less than religious fervour bordering on the fanaticism he harboured and advocated. The massed crowds gave him the sense of his own infallibility in which he revelled. Now that he had rebuilt the country in his image, he returned to the other central theme that had driven him on, no opportunity had been lost to place blame for the ravages of poverty and political backstabbing firmly where he wanted it, with the Jews, the enemy within. When Herschel Grünspan, the son of a Jewish family expelled from Poland, shot Ernst von Rath, an official in the German embassy in Paris on November the 7th, the die was cast. Jewish newspapers were banned. Von Rath died on the 9th, and Hitler left a dinner in commemoration of the beer hall putsch of 1923. Goebbels gave a speech making it clear that spontaneous demonstrations in protest against the death should not be hindered. The intention was clear. In November 1938, the synagogues began to burn. Hitler needed still to eradicate Czechoslovakia before he could turn to Poland. He ordered President Hatcher to Berlin in March. He threatened the president with bombardment of Prague by the Luftwaffe unless he agreed to the occupation of the country. That same day, the final non-violent invasion during Hitler's dictatorship took place when German troops entered Czechoslovakia on the morning of March the 15th. The shock waves went around the world. Only now did the realization sink in that Hitler did not want peace, and the only way to stop him was to face him with troops. Europe, unprepared for war, was going to have to fight for freedom. Hitler was 50 1 month after occupying Czechoslovakia. He was a man convinced that his dreams were within his grasp. "My enemies," he said contemptuously of the men he had met in Munich, "are little worms." The celebration was to be a final display of his might before the real fighting began, a chance to rally the nation once again and fire their enthusiasm for him, make them willing to follow him wherever he led them. The cowardly Democrats, as he thought of them, were invited to watch the 4-hour procession of arms in the hands of the most modern army on earth. He was no longer hiding his intentions, he was boasting. Whilst the people revelled in the new German might and their Chancellor, who had restored their status in the world so that they could peacefully take part in world affairs, Hitler, having spent 6 years grooming them, had already planned their future. And the future that he had planned was one of unceasing conflict in the fight for domination and Lebensraum. The banners and pomp only served to feed his egotism. What he saw before him were the men who would give their lives for his appalling fantasies. Armies do not exist for peace, but solely for exertion in war, he had said. The pageantry appealed to his sense of the monumental, mimicking the operatic exaggerations of Wagner which fed his image of himself and the world that was to come. Whilst he planned, he presented an avuncular figure to the world. The world he was creating was filled with cruelty, hate, and death. In Eva Braun's private films, taken in Hitler's mountain residence at the Berghof at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler was always surrounded by the same small coterie of friends and advisors. Ribbentrop, Goebbels, Himmler and Heydrich. Albert Speer was there too as Hitler's architect of choice. Speer recalled a sense of emptiness shrouding the house and its oppressive atmosphere. From his mountaintop, Hitler could see across to where Friedrich Barbarossa, the medieval German warrior emperor, was said to be buried. Hitler was a man obsessed with bringing the heroic German past into the present to make his own glory shine brighter. Death was what had always given life to his fantasies. Death would soon bring him triumphs. Death would give him the pleasure that nothing and no one else ever could. Death brought him euphoria. Although he was secure with his cronies, Hitler was seldom seen with the group, rarely joining in with the merriment. He seemed still to be as unable to cope with emotional closeness as he had always been, and in this respect, Eva Braun was no more privileged than the others. Only the inner circle knew of her relationship with Hitler. To the outside world, she was one of many who worked for the government. His adoring female admirers were not allowed to know that he kept a mistress. Eva Braun had been an assistant working for Hitler's photographer Heinrich Hoffmann in Munich, and met Hitler for the first time when she was 17. She was a happy and bubbly personality that attracted Hitler immediately, although at the time she did not know who he was. She was flattered that the older man was interested in her, but the liaison was kept a secret from her parents, not least because her father was scathing about Hitler. When he found out, he wrote to Hitler to discourage the relationship. No one knows what the nature of the relationship was, but as Hitler's rise to power swiftly progressed, she became dispirited and then suffered depression, wanting to spend more time with him than he had to offer. She attempted suicide twice during the early years, the first time in November 1932, when she tried to shoot herself with her father's pistol. She narrowly missed the artery in her neck, and Hitler, although campaigning for the election to become Chancellor, rushed to be with her. She survived, much to Hitler's relief, who did not want a scandal to break over him at such a time. Eva only became aware that Hitler's niece Gaily had also been Hitler's girlfriend, after Gaily had committed suicide in 1931. But the relationship with Gaily had continued for 2 years after Hitler met Eva. Gaily, it appears, discovered a letter from Eva to Hitler just before she died. She then shot herself in the heart. Hitler was distraught at Gaily's death, and there was always a picture of her in a room at the Berghof. Eva never knew who the woman portrayed was. Hitler was said to have revered the painting. The seeds of inhumanity, said his photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, began to grow in him after Gaily's death. Gaily's mother Angela, Hitler's half-sister, was his housekeeper at Berchtesgaden, but disapproving of the relationship with Eva Braun, she eventually left. From 1931 onwards, 2 years after their first meeting, the two began to see more of one another. What he felt for Eva is unknown, though it is certain that she was more than just a bedtime distraction for him. He used a pet name for her, Schaperl. Hitler, however, was also seeing other women such as Erna Hafenstangl, a society beauty, and Renate Müller, a German actress who also died under unknown circumstances, perhaps suicide. The speculation as to whether Hitler was capable of loving his women companions cannot be satisfactorily explained. Otto Strasser, brother of Gregor, who was murdered during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, maintained that Hitler did not know what normal love was, and that his sexual tendencies were abnormal. Gaily killed herself as a result of that, he alleged. Hitler's secretary wrote, Hitler always maintained that Germany was his lover, and that sex was never a feature of his life after he came to power. Other sources dispute that claim. As for children, he was scathing about having children of his own. The children of a genius, he said, would find it difficult to live up to their parent. They usually turn out to be idiots. Hitler later allowed men to have sex with partners they were not married to. In his opinion, it was more important that good Aryan children were born than that society morals should be maintained. A motherhood cult was brought into being that culminated in the Lebensborn organization set up by Himmler for SS wives and unmarried mothers. The organization adopted children with the aim of producing superior Aryans. In 1936, Eva became part of his household, though she never slept in the same rooms as Hitler, and they were never seen in public together. She also had separate rooms in the Berlin bunker and Hitler's residences in Berlin. She was described as being simple but bringing lightness into Hitler's life. Her delight in being photographed and predilection for sunbathing naked made Hitler furious. Nonetheless, at the beginning they shared common interests, films and gossip about actors and actresses, which Hitler also enjoyed. Both she and Hitler were keen viewers of movies. Despite the differences, this girl, who Hitler did not even want to change her hairstyle, was devoted to him. He, it was noted, became jollier when he heard her voice. When he neglected her, she was reported to be in tears. Her diaries of 1935 are filled with her loneliness and constant waiting for Hitler to have time for her. As the administration of his Reich took up more of his time, Eva was left to herself more and more often. Yet she was the mistress, as she described herself, and companion of the most powerful man in Germany, and, as she saw it, the world, and enjoyed the status and lifestyle it gave to her, so she accepted that this was how life had to be. Hitler allowed her to wear makeup, which was scorned in the Third Reich, and to smoke and drink, and he would spend hours drinking tea with her in her rooms or in his study, where there would be champagne, chocolates, fruit and flowers. But he could not reciprocate the intensity of the emotion that Eva brought to the relationship. In fact, it irritated him, and he could be very cavalier in his dealings with her. He ought never marry an intelligent woman, he said, adding that only very simple women should be his companions. Eva had changed from the happy young woman she had been before she met Hitler. She was reported by one eyewitness to be clamped up when Hitler was around. But when others were there or when she went to dances, she once again became the carefree young woman that she was. On May the 28th, 1935, when the reply from Hitler that she had hoped for did not arrive, Eva tried to commit suicide again by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. She failed. Hitler, again afraid of scandal, went to her bedside carrying a puppy. Afterwards he treated her better, giving her the royalties from the Hoffmann photographs of him, from which she was also given a Mercedes car and a villa in a Munich suburb to keep her away from public scrutiny. He told her that she was the only woman he wanted. But as he inched towards war, a moody Hitler became once more less considerate towards Eva. She was in any case never allowed to be present at official functions, always being ordered out of the room beforehand. Should she and her friends arrive back before a meeting was over, they would have to sneak in through the tradesman's entrance. On occasion, Albert Speer kept her company exiled in her room, and wrote that he developed sympathy for this unhappy woman. As the war began to go badly, Hitler would have been willing to let Eva go if she wanted to find another man. There were unsubstantiated rumors of an affair with Himmler's liaison officer, SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein. She was certainly attracted to him, but for Eva, Hitler was the only man she wanted to be with. In the end, a political marriage took place between Eva's younger sister Gretel and Hermann Fegelein. But when Fegelein was caught apparently preparing to escape to Sweden with his mistress as the war was coming to an end, Hitler ordered that he be executed. Eva's widowed sister was pregnant. Hitler considered releasing Fegelein, but whether he was shot after a court-martial or not, he disappeared. Gretel's daughter committed suicide in 1975. Hitler was also known to have been a vegetarian, although it is argued that he did eat meat on occasion. Goebbels mentioned that Hitler thought meat-eating harmful to humanity and intended to deal with the problem once the war had ended. One report tells of Hitler averting his eyes when cruelty to animals occurred on screen, and whilst human life seemed of no interest to the Führer, the Nazis' anti-cruelty to animal laws were at the time unequalled. And Blondie, the Alsatian dog that Martin Bormann had given to him, was still with Hitler in his bunker in Berlin in the last days. Blondie was given a cyanide capsule as a test of their effectiveness before Hitler took his own life. The Berghof was his preferred residence. Here, he said, was where the momentous decisions were made. These often took months to arrive at. He was never quite certain, it seemed. The Berghof was also used for official functions. The only moments that seemed to please him were when he was imitating his guests. Otherwise, Hitler was alone with the inner loathing and anger that eroded his humanity. He played the game of favourites with his cohorts, always keeping them aware that their favoured status rested on his goodwill. Who would be permitted to walk with him on his morning stroll, and what was the significance of the choice? But his inner circle were protected from the world that Hitler was creating outside. His private life was safe from the degenerate workings of the state he had created, and that was how he wanted it to remain. In May 1939, Hitler was able to order his personal doctor, Karl Brandt, that an advisory committee should be set up to devise a program to kill disabled children. Hitler's chancellery would act as secret administrator for the program. Hitler knew that even now these plans would cause an outcry if they became public. Later that year, the state governments were required to register the disabled. By 1942, drugs, lethal injection or starvation would kill children with disabilities up to the age of 12.
Auf das unser Volk nicht an den typischen Degenerationserscheinungen dieser neuen Zeit zugrunde geht.
Poland had rejected Hitler's attempts to make it a satellite state on 3 occasions. Now, supported by Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, he decided that invasion was necessary, but he could not risk war with Russia as well as the British and French, who had agreed to help Poland in the event of German aggression. The final piece of the puzzle to enable Hitler to attack Poland was to neutralize the Soviet Union. Stalin was blinded by his distrust of the West, allowing himself to be maneuvered into a treaty by a man who harbored as much loathing for the Russian people and their leader as he did hatred for the Jews, and whose stated aim was to expand German territory into Russia. Hitler was not yet ready to take on the Soviet Union, but it was, in his mind, simply a question of time. The 2 foreign ministers of Germany and Russia provided the proof of his manipulatory skills when they signed a non-aggression pact between the 2 countries in Moscow in the early hours of August 24th, 1939. Stalin had fallen into Hitler's trap, duped by the promise of military technology in return for wheat, oil, and other raw materials which arrived in Germany during the first year of the pact. Vital contributions that helped to keep the country on its course of full-scale militarization. But even as a second pact was being negotiated in 1940, Hitler was planning Stalin's downfall. No one was safe from Hitler's intrigues and greed for single-handed power, or the lies he was prepared to tell to achieve his goal. On the 3rd of September, Hitler was finally able to give a speech with the text that he had fervently been waiting to give for so long, concerning the only thing in life that mattered to him. The destroyer Schleswig-Holstein had opened fire on Poland. Finally, Hitler felt ready to enter into a conflict with his neighbours. Fortune had favoured his arrogance and brinkmanship. It was to do so for the foreseeable future. Hitler's brutally effective Wehrmacht swept the Polish army aside. Success was so rapid that Hitler was able to visit the front lines just a few days later. He was impressed by his generals, whose swift crushing of Polish resistance had been completed much more quickly than he had envisaged. His fantasies had become Europe's nightmares. France and Britain's declaration of war on Germany was a threat without consequences that could not prevent Poland's collapse within 2 weeks. As the smoke blackened the skies, Hitler's megalomania took shape, and he declared that this fate awaited anyone who crossed him. The roundup of opposition and Polish Jews began immediately, proving that his threats were not without consequences. German and Soviet troops met at Brest-Litovsk after the capitulation. Poland was in the hands of two of the worst dictators who had ever come to power. The mass murders of civilians by the SS and special units, which had instructions to murder influential members of the establishment and members of the intelligentsia, took Polish civilian losses to an estimated 200,000 during the campaign. Then the next phase of Hitler's plan could begin, the killing of the Jews, followed by the deaths of those unfit for labour or breeding. And he could begin to gather the slave labourers from amongst the inferior races and Nazi opponents who would help to build his new 1,000-year Reich. There had been some 12 million of these by the time the war was over, of whom 2/3 came from Eastern Europe. Martin Bormann became Hitler's closest advisor after the flight and arrest of Rudolf Hess in May 1941. He was promoted to head of the party chancellery. He was Hitler's most trusted Nazi companion, controlling access to the Führer and apparently keeping from him the descriptions of the worst excesses by the SS against the Jewish people. On the 9th of October 1942, he wrote that it was Hitler's belief that the Jewish problem could only be solved through the special camps in the East. The appeal of striking at Britain's ships that were needed for the country's survival was inescapable for Hitler. Had it not been the British blockade of Germany in World War I that had helped to defeat Germany's forces, now it was his turn to begin a blockade of Britain. But his support for the U-boats was half-hearted, and initially he thought of them as purely defensive weapons. Admiral Karl Dönitz was therefore never given the financial and political support he needed to carry out his war as successfully as he thought possible. Nonetheless, Britain was unprepared and the losses were considerable. Hitler's sense of his own greatness and infallibility increased. On the day that the Wehrmacht began their assault in the West, Winston Churchill took over as Prime Minister of Britain and her empire. Hitler's determination had brought another man of equal determination to oppose him. Denmark, unable to defend itself against such a mighty neighbour, was overrun in 4 hours, but was just a stepping stone for the Wehrmacht to Norway. When the British had attacked the German ship, the Altmark, in neutral Norwegian waters in February 1940, Hitler knew that Britain would not respect Norwegian neutrality if it was not in her interests to do so. He ordered that his own invasion plans be swiftly finalised. In April, the British rushed troops northwards once they realised what was happening, but Hitler's plans had been well carried out. Norway collapsed. Hitler's generals felt that they were not ready for conflict with France and Britain, but Hitler, buoyed by success, was astute enough to know that his chance was now, whilst the Allies were unprepared. Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of German High Command, had presented a plan of invasion to Hitler that would have been very difficult to carry out. Halder was at the time conspiring against Hitler and was carrying a gun in his pocket ready to shoot him when the time came. Sadly, it never did. Holland and Belgium fell under the German onslaught. The BEF and French were split by a German armoured advance to the French coast and herded onto the beaches at Dunkirk, where they awaited death under Luftwaffe bombs. Hitler was now interfering in the plans of his general staff, believing that he alone had the ability to win wars. His own indecision, that was to plague his orders so often over the course of the war, caused an event that led eventually to his own downfall years later. he ordered that the panzers stop the advance on the British. Between the 27th of May and the 4th of June 1940, more than 338,000 French and British soldiers were taken from the beaches. It is unlikely that the true reason for Hitler's decision will ever be known. The probability is that, hoping to conclude a pact with the British and avoid any further fighting before he turned east once more, Hitler was making a conciliatory gesture. The other possibility is that his attention was taken for those vital days in finishing the invasion of France, whose defeat was so important, as it was another step on the path to wiping out the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. Also, Goering had claimed that the Luftwaffe would be able to finish the job on the Dunkirk beaches without help, and Hitler allowed himself to be persuaded by a tactic that would spare men and armour. Whatever the reason, the order proved in retrospect to be fatal for Hitler. At the moment of his greatest triumph, when he announced that it was better to allow a beaten army home to show the people what a beating they had suffered, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction. His arrogance had got the better of him, and the ease of his success led him to overestimate his own strength and underestimate that of his opponents. Then France collapsed in the face of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe onslaught. It was Hitler's most glorious triumph. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was moved to call him the greatest military leader of all time. Europe was staring into the abyss.
Sind in Deutschland die Würfel gefallen. Und ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch heute auch noch lachen,